As your astrologer and life coach, I advise you to stay away from any clickbait articles handed up to you by algorithms that suggest that comedian Carrot Top is now transsexual, or that The Rock is in a romantic relationship with a man. And no, I was not caught in a crypto clearinghouse scandal back in 2019, so far as any congressional subcommittee knows. James Burnham, in his book, The Managerial Revolution back in the 1940s, makes a good point about the difference between a dictatorship and an authoritarian state. He stresses the fact that all societies are made up of a number of different institutions: government, religion, academia, media, art, marriage, and so forth. A dictator is someone who only wants to take over one institution: government. In an authoritarian state, by contrast, the despot wants to take over all the institutions, like Henry VIII wanting to be both the king and the head of the church. As a society becomes more complex, we see a segregation of duties, a separation of powers. For instance, in a primitive society, every caveman has to be responsible for everything. He has to know how to build his own shelter, how to hunt his own food, how to make his own clothes, and so forth. Only as civilization gets more complex do we get specialization. Adam Smith talks about this in The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. There, he uses the famous example of the pin factory. If you have a single person trying to make pins, he might make 10 in a day, but by breaking up the number of steps and having people who specialize, you can get 18,000 pins in a day. So specialization is a hallmark of an advanced society. The person who makes your shoes also doesn't deliver your mail. The person who tends bar also doesn't perform open heart surgery. This is the precept behind having a separation of powers in a republic. We got this idea from the Romans. They rejected their last king, Tarquin, and set up a republic to separate the functions of a society so that no single man could have that much power. So in a republic, the chief executive cannot also be the head of the Supreme Court. The president is not supposed to be the head of the church, nor is he supposed to be in charge of social media or academia or any of the other institutions in the society. When you get an authoritarian, it reverses the process. We go from civilization back to the primitive caveman period, where all of the functions of society are vested in a single individual, like the primitive Munduruku tribe in the Brazilian jungle, where every member of the tribe has to have the skills of a dozen different people to be able to survive. These primitive tribes are constantly at war. Why? Because they don't have rule of law or any mediation infrastructure. Aristotle says that all governments have three basic functions: creating infrastructure, establishing a military, and instituting courts to keep people from fighting with each other. So in an authoritarian state, we see the full life cycle of a civilization, from violence to mediation by law, back to violence. The authoritarian is as hungry for control of all the institutions as the savage is of having the full skill set of every sector of the society. Sociologists have run experiments in game theory, like having people from different cultures around the world play the game The Prisoner's Dilemma. Kate Raworth talks about this in her book, Donut Economics. What they discovered was that people from primitive tribes were greedy, sociopathic, and not inclined to share. By contrast, people from modern market-based societies come from systems that require interdependence. So people from, say, the United States show generosity, a consciousness of justice, empathy. Primitive tribes, who don't rely on anyone else for resources, can afford to act in opposite ways. The authoritarian, likewise, reflects this change in mindset. Once he controls all the institutions and doesn't feel like he needs anyone else, he immediately turns into a sociopath. He no longer feels a responsibility to his fellow citizens. The German philosopher Hegel said, "There are no responsibilities without rights, and no rights without responsibilities." This reminds me of a commentator on a conservative website who said that liberalism is predicated on having no responsibilities, like how they're promoting to college students the idea that they don't have to pay back their debts. The person leaving a comment observed the fact that liberalism makes a big deal about being anti-racist so that you don't have a responsibility to your own people, to promote atheism so that you don't have a responsibility to God. Think about it this way. If you want to take people's rights, the stealth way to do it is to take away their responsibilities. Responsibilities are tied to rights, as Hegel said. The aforementioned Aristotle observed in Politics that one of the chief methods of the tyrant to stay in power is to promote vice, degeneracy, lack of responsibility. The authoritarian fears an ethical populace because they might come after him, so he promotes immorality. He wants people distracted by their own addictions so that they won't pay attention to him. As a result, the schools in an authoritarian state don't teach civics to kids, but vice. As Montague says, a vice-ridden population makes for bad citizens, but for good slaves. He writes, "In a despotic state, each house is a separate government. As education, therefore, consists chiefly of social converse, it must be very much limited. All it does is to strike the heart with fear and to imprint on the understanding a very simple notion of a few principles of religion. Learning here proves dangerous, emulation fatal. And as to virtue, Aristotle cannot think there is any one virtue belonging to slaves. If so, education in despotic countries is confined within a very narrow compass. Here, therefore, education is in some measure needless. To give something, one must take everything, and begin with making a bad subject in order to make a good slave. If you've gotten this far, you must be inclined toward our content. If you haven't already, go to thenewamerican.com and subscribe to our print magazine, published twice a month in print and every day online. It's the essential news source for freedom-loving Americans.